open book is Mark Polymoropolis. And Mark, I got to tell you, I am so happy I pronounced the name right because, I'm an Italian kid from Long Island and I can butcher people's last names. A CIA veteran, a best-selling author, an MSNBC national security analyst, but also several decade career at the CIA serving our country. And so first off, Mark, thank you so much for the service. The title of the book, Clarity in Crisis, Leadership Lessons from the CIA. It's a phenomenal book. It's a quick book, Mark. I enjoyed reading it. It took me about 3.5 hours to read it. Loved it. Loved your stories in it. You also go over who you are as a person. We share our baseball love in common.
That's
although
right.
Our teams are somewhat different. We share our baseball love. But let's go right to starting at the agency in 1993. You became one of the CIA's most decorated field officers. You spent time in Greece every summer. You are obviously Greek origin. You traveled to Algeria with your dad. I'm Italian-American. You're Greek-American. Tell us about your background and what led you into the CIA.
Sure. So first of all, Anthony, thanks for having me here. I got to start with just a quick story. I always talk about this when people pronounce my last name. So give me 1 second. We'll dive into it. But I was in the Middle East. I was the deputy station chief. I can't tell you which country. I've still sworn to secrecy on that. But I get a phone call from the president's briefers. This was when George W. Bush was there. And they were going down to the Oval and they were going to brief him on a breaking situation. They wanted my take on it. So I was pretty pumped. I was, still kind of a mid-career, mid-level manager at the agency. So I gave them my 2 cents. They go down there. They say they're going to call me back in a couple hours when they come back from the White House. I wait by the secure phone. I get the phone call and I said, "How was the Oval session with W?" And they said it was awesome. And I said, "Why? Did he think my analysis was solid?" They said, "Well, he spent the whole time trying to pronounce your last name." So that's my claim to fame. But everyone there always kind of butchers it, and I love it. And anytime.
Well, I gotta ask you this though because I know him a long time. He nicknames people. Did you get a nickname out of him?
I don't know. I don't know. That's right. He did nickname people, and talking about in terms of even jumping into kind of the leadership stuff, and we can talk about it in a sec. But his leadership after 9/11 was extraordinary. I was in New York City. And just pretty amazing his visits and how he rallied the city, a diverse population in the country. So I get chills even thinking about what he did for New Yorkers during that time period. So I just throw that out.
I love I'll be very candid with my feelings. I love President Bush. I didn't know his dad, frankly. I met him a few times, but I got to really know President Bush because of what happened in 9/11. Our mutual friends like Tom Higgins and things that I was doing to help post 9/11. His nickname for me, Mark, was Gucci Scaramucci.
I love it.
Okay, Gucci Scaramucci. He always comes up with something, right? So I guess I had Gucci loafers on that day. I guess I don't know. So, but go into your background if you don't mind, because I think you have this fascinating background. You write about it in the book. Take us through your background.
Look, I mean, it's an immigrant success story, starting with my dad, who came from Greece on a Fulbright scholarship. Comes to the United States, spends 40 years as a professor at Rutgers University, it's the story of someone making it in America. Now, I was born in Greece as well, so I had that same kind of dual background where we'd go back to Greece every summer. Traveled all over the world. That gave me my kind of interest in foreign affairs. And, a seminal event for me was in 1980. I was 10 years old. My dad had taken a sabbatical in Algeria, a small North African country, which at that time was not racked by a later Islamic insurgency, which killed, tens of thousands of people, but it was relatively safe. And so, Anthony, listen to this. At 10 years old, my mother dropped me off at JFK Airport alone. Would you do this with your kids? 10. Puts me on a plane to Paris, and I fly to Algiers. I meet up with my dad, and my father and I spend 1 month driving 2,000 miles through the Sahara Desert in a Volkswagen minibus. And I thought I was Lawrence of Arabia, and boom, I was done. I wanted some kind of career in foreign affairs, intelligence, something like since when I was 10. So that hooked me.
Well, first of all, I love the story, but yes, can I believe it? I can believe it. We were latchkey kids. I don't know what my parents were doing. My father was smoking a cigarette. I was sitting in the middle of the front seat with no seatbelt, and he was letting me drive the car. So just give you a sense of how we grew up. And I was at the station diner near the Long Island Railroad, 2:00 in the morning at 11 years old, eating pancakes with my cousins. So I don't know what the hell these people were doing.
That's right.
But it also makes me think that we're over parenting and we're over helicoptering our kids.
No, I mean, I think about, when growing up in Jersey, in central Jersey, I'd jump on the train in New Brunswick when I was, again, 12, 13, go with my buddies into the garden to watch Ranger hockey games alone.
Yeah.
And, who knows when I come back.
That's how I became a Mets fan.
Whatever. Yeah.
I'm totally with you. I used to do so the Mets, when they were traveling, they'd have that like 1:30 game on a Wednesday or Thursday. I would deliver my newspapers in the summer, take the train at 11 years old by myself, and get a general admission ticket and keep score of the game. My parents had no idea where I was, no cell phones, no AirTag, Apple AirTag up my you-know-what to find out where I am. But let's talk about this career, okay? Sure. Why the CIA? What can you tell us about the farm? Why is it called the farm, as an example? And what do you think makes a good intelligence officer?
Well, great question. So, look, I was interested in foreign policy. Again, I was born in Greece, had all these crazy experiences traveling. We went back every summer to the Greek islands. So my parents gave me some really incredible experiences seeing the world at a very young age. So I knew I wanted to do something. What it was going to be, it was either going to be CIA, perhaps the State Department, perhaps the military, but I wanted to do something. And I think I probably read a whole bunch of Tom Clancy books. And so when I was at university, I went to Cornell University, and I walked into the recruitment center, and I had an interview, and after a very long process, a grueling 18-month security background check, probably because all of my travel and my kind of relatives overseas, but I was finally hired. And off I went into this kind of incredible 26-year career. But again, one of the things that I think I go back to is that I was a middle-class kid from New Jersey. And when I go and I talk to college students all the time now, and I had this amazing career, and I feel very, lucky and fortunate to have worked with real heroes in the intelligence community. But I was just a normal kid. I don't come from any kind of special background. My dad was making $30,000 a year as a college professor. We had he drove an old Dodge Dart that had a hole rusting hole in the floorboard. And so it really is a kind of a success story, a true American success story, in the sense you can do some unusual things if you really put your mind to it. So off I went to the agency. And you asked a great question in terms of what makes the best intelligence officers. And, so I'm not here as a former Navy SEAL kind of pounding my chest saying we're going to charge a hill. And I love those guys and I work with them very closely. But I think that it's the characteristic of humility. And that can go across, so many walks of life, but just being humble, because it was a high risk, high fail profession. So I did things that were extraordinary. I feel proud that the operations that I ran saved hundreds of American lives. But I also know I screwed up sometimes, and there were some terrible consequences in which friends of mine died, and I was involved in that. And so it's just the idea of staying humble, and I think that's a character trait that's absolutely critical. And your final question is, what's the farm, and what can I tell you about that? That's of course the training program at CIA, where you go to a not so secret base in the Mid-Atlantic of the United States, and it takes about a year to you learn what's called tradecraft, and that's how to recruit an agent. That's how to run a surveillance detection route. It's really a weeding out process, in finding people who have not necessarily type A personalities, but have that, because introverts can do very well too, but have that kind of mental fortitude to operate on your own. Let's go back to my growing up in New Jersey, what we talked about. So why was I a successful CIA officer? Well, at CIA, as a case officer, an operations officer, we operate alone all the time. So here I am growing up with parents who gave me there was not even a leash. There was no leash. So I had a lot of confidence in myself, and how to react to certain situations, how to make decisions. And that really was honed with this tradecraft training down the farm, which was ultimately, it wasn't difficult in the sense of mentally tough. It was all about time management. It's about how do you react to so many situations that are thrown at you. And the training's actually very good. It's very realistic. And, I think back to that time period, and I'm very thankful for, a lot of the instructors I had along the way.
Well, First of all, I've had the chance to go. I've never been to the farm, but I've been to Quantico.
Right.
And as you know, I've been on troop support missions. I've been to Iraq and Afghanistan. Obviously, lots of our embassies. I've watched Homeland, Polymoropolis. Okay, I've read Daniel Silva and Ken Follett and David Balducci. So, where is the separation between truth and fiction?
Wow. So Hollywood does not necessarily get it right. But there's a couple things. One is, as a former intelligence officer, I always have to be kind of careful in my critique of Hollywood movies or some novels, because they're designed to entertain. There are some that are quite good, though. So Homeland, which was a lot of fun, is not anything even close to reality. I would say that there's a couple authors who have gotten it pretty close to reality. One is David Ignatius, Washington Post columnist, a friend of mine. He wrote a book called Agents of Innocence about a CIA case officer in Beirut, loosely based on true events. But again, it gave a really good idea of what life is like as a case officer. And then most recently, there's another friend of mine from the agency, David McCloskey. He wrote a book called Damascus Station, which is about operations in Syria after kind of the terrible events of the Civil War. Again, fiction, but with a lot of reality thrown in there.
The agency's okay with this stuff. Obviously, you guys have to vet this stuff with the agency and so forth. They, in some ways, they like it, right? Because they want to get this stuff out there to help their recruiting efforts. But they also want to be careful about not giving up too much, right? Fair to say.
So one of the things that we do, and as I made the decision after I retired to kind of come out in public and talk to the media, and of course now I work with MSNBC, but I did so just with the idea that I thought it was good for the American people to hear from the operations side of the house. There's a lot of former analysts who speak out in public, but I wanted the American public to understand what the CIA was about for a couple reasons. One is because I think it is absolutely indispensable for the security of the country. But number two, it also, we get a black eye every once in a while. There's some things we've done in the past that cause a lot of controversy. And if we don't have people out there explaining, the good parts, the positive aspects of what the intelligence community can do, I think we risk a lot. But with that all in mind, everything I do and everything I write has to go through the publication review process. And so the agency does. Because when I signed a secrecy agreement at the beginning of my career, it lasts a lifetime. So I cannot ever divulge classified information, and I honor that. I have a great relationship with the agency when it comes to the
I get that because I had the same thing in the White House. When they gave us an intelligence briefing, can't say anything about it, and of course, never do.
Right.
So the truth and fiction are somewhat separated. But there's a lot of truth in the fiction. People are out there as intelligence officers. They're analyzing data. Some of them are actually in the field as human intelligence agents doing operations on behalf of the United States, disrupting terrorists, catching people that are money laundering, catching people that are acting in interests against the United States, doing it surreptitiously. All of this is fair to say, right? You more or less write about it in the book in that vague way. I guess what I want to talk to you about is the word ambiguity. You remember writing about this. It talks a lot about, you talk about ambiguity and being comfortable with ambiguity. So tell our viewers and listeners what that means. What does it mean to be comfortable with ambiguity?
Sure. So it's when you don't have situational awareness. You can call it when you're operating in those times of gray, where you don't actually know what's going on, but you're okay with it. And to me, that was something that it was a skill that I learned to kind of hone over time, to a point where that was my happy place when there are ambiguous situations. Okay, we don't really understand what's happening, but you know what? You're the one who raises your hand and you say, send me, I got this. I'll figure it out. Me and my team will figure this out wherever we go. And that to me was a great hallmark of CIA. We're never looking. Why would you call in the intelligence community if we were looking for knowns already? There's always the unknown. And so to me, that was something that was what I was very proud of at the end of my career. I was really good at those situations. Okay. And there's so many, we've been attacked by a terrorist group. We have to track down the group. How do we do that? there's a weapons of mass destruction. There's some kind of proliferation, concern. Really hard. Who's gonna say yes and kind of jump into the fray? I'll never forget, Anthony. I can talk about this. Going into northern Iraq before the war. This is in late 2002. Myself and 9 others, joint CIA Special Forces team, went to live with the Kurds up in northern Iraq. And we got up there, but it was a terrible kind of logistics train. Our weapons didn't even arrive. What do we do? Okay, we'll figure it out. We'll get some from the local partners. We have no exfil plan. Helicopters couldn't reach us. All right, we're going to figure out. Literally, the plan was we're going to walk into Iran if we have to, if Saddam Hussein's forces come across the lines and attack us. So that's the idea of being comfortable in the uncomfortable. And to me, that was just an incredible skill that CIA officers end up developing because that's kind of the true nature of the intelligence business is kind of understanding, finding, fixing, working really hard problems.
It's really good stuff. Let's dig into the 9 principles. You've got adversity and humility in there.
Right.
I have those as bumper stickers. One's on my forehead, the other one's on my backside. Okay. You have the glue guy or the glue girl. I love that. So I want you to talk a little bit about the glue guy or the glue girl. But let's go over your 9 principles. Tell us a little bit about each of them, if you don't mind.
So these are 9 principles on leadership, and again, it's the idea of how to be comfortable in the uncomfortable. When times are tough, you're the one who's going to raise your hand, and so all these principles build on each other. And it's the idea of, and it's not only for individuals, it's the idea of how to build kind of cohesive teams that are able to operate in that place, in that time of gray. And what I found was, as I look back on my career and some kind of seminal events, huge operations, I kind of dissected this. Is why I wrote the book. And I said, how did we succeed in that time? So I came up with these, and I'll jump into with the idea of the glue guy or the glue gal. And that's a notion that every member of your team is indispensable, and that is something that is counterintuitive. If you're in special operations, it's the door kicker. You think they're important. Well, are they really? What about the logistics personnel? What about the support personnel? If you're in sales, who's the one in front of the customer? Well, hold on a second. Who prepared everything in the background? So it's the idea of celebrating those behind the scenes that are just as important. And when you have a high performing team, you understand that. You celebrate successes amongst everyone, but you also, in your planning, you take everybody into account. I'll never forget, I was sitting at a CIA station one time, it dawned on me. We were planning some operations. We were having a morning meeting. I had all the case officers there. And then I said to myself, where's our finance officer? And they brought the finance officer here, and he said, why am I here? I said, well, actually, we can't run the operation if we don't have any money to do it. So every leadership team we're going to have from now on, I want the finance officer and the support officer, as well as case officers, the door kickers, in with me. And that's the idea. You start understanding the importance. And I'll tell you, as a baseball fan, all about that. I bet you could tell me glue guys from the New York Mets that go back 20 to 30 years who are critical. That 1986 World Series team. Who are the glue guys there? They don't win without them. They might not be on the All-Star team. They might not be MVP, but in the sports world, this is
somebody definitely in the year 2000 was Joe McEwing. I don't even know if you remember that guy.
Right.
But Joe was a utility player. He's managing now in AAA. Could easily be a Major League Baseball manager. Super smart guy. But I get the point. You need people on a team that are willing to go all out, but also get the fact that they're on a team. Derek Jeter, who's become a friend subsequent to his career. I didn't really know him during his career. One thing he said to me that I always share with people is he could have cared less about his stats. He was, you had a situation where the ball was going into the third base spectator stands, and he's at shortstop. A-Rod is at third base. So A-Rod's closer to the ball. Right. Jeter's out racing A-Rod for the ball. He dives into the stands and gets a fracture of his cheekbone, catches the foul ball.
Yep.
I don't know anything more metaphorical of Derek or A-Rod, to be candid. One was a glue guy and the other one was a stat. What are my stats and what's important to me guy? And that happens in life. How do you know who you can count on? We've all been stabbed in the back. I've got, you live in a funky place, Washington. I thought, Trump had one of the best lines ever. I was in the Oval Office with Trump, And he says, yeah, he goes, I thought I was a killer, man. I was a real estate developer. I thought I was dealing with all these like killers and vultures and in New York. He says, here in Washington, he says, Scaramucci, the secretaries will cut you. The secretaries will make you bleed out,
Right.
meaning that the secretaries are more ruthless in Washington than even the killer New York City developers. I felt in Washington, they would take your eyeball out with like an ice pick and they would drop it in their dirty martini glass. You're bleeding at the table, Mark, and they're still talking to you like nothing happened. Like, well, that's what we do here in Washington. We take each other's eyeballs out and drop them in martini glasses. So what do you say about all that? How do you know when you can count on somebody? And what do you say about the treachery that is around us from small-minded, insecure people?
So what a great question. I think about when you walk into CIA headquarters, on the right, you have the memorial wall, which are the stars on the wall. This signifies our officers killed in the line of duty, and it's incredibly sobering. I have friends who are on that wall, and on the left, though, there's it's equally as important because there's a line that's etched in stone. It's a biblical verse, and it says, "And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." But that's the idea about integrity. And I will tell you, Anthony, that's the only thing that we have, kind of honor and integrity, to as foundations. And so, while sometimes we are betrayed, and that happens in life, my view is you always have to give people the benefit of the doubt. That's the only way to kind of move forward in a positive fashion. Now, sometimes you're going to be disappointed. I remember in my career, I would help a young officer with something. I'm trying. I push really hard for a promotion, and the officer gets promoted, and then somehow down the line, I hear they're shit talking me some way, and I'm like, wow, that's a bit of a betrayal. But you know what? It was still the right thing to do to get that officer promoted. And so there's just a set of ethics and kind of the integrity that you have. That's all you really have in the end. So I think it's just the idea that these things are going to happen. You try to build teams around trust. You certainly get to, you kind of go around, you get to know your team. One of the things I'd love to do, and I got better at this as a manager, is I would try to understand my people more. So you have it, let's say you're running a unit of 10 individuals or 20 individuals, and you could be the head of a Fortune 500 company because these are some of your top managers. But I'd get them together, and we wouldn't talk about work. I said, tell me something about yourself. And so you build trust that way. You try to have empathy with your employees and your peers as well. But at the end of the day, sometimes human nature kind of bites you. And so, there's we've all been stabbed in the back in the past, but you try to kind of move forward and kind of live by that honor or that code of honesty and integrity, which ironically for a place like CIA is something that is really important because we're entrusted with just a critical mission. We have unique authorities. We have incredible amounts of power. And so that's what you have to really kind of, you have to live that code every day.
You said something when I read it, I was like, okay, that is actually true. It doesn't feel like it at the time. You said that in adversity is a performance enhancing drug, and I've been kicked in the face. I've been fired. I've been lit up in the American media, international media. And when I'm in an adverse situation, like I own Bitcoin and it's dropping 65% for the year, and I've got every client and their mother coming at me with a hatchet, it doesn't feel good, Mark. Right. And so, tell me why adversity is a performance-enhancing drug.
So for me, I came up with that one of the principles, adversity is the PED to success. It's because every really incredible elite team that I'd been on, we had failed prior to that, but before some huge success. I mean, it's just something that this is based on my experiences. This is not just something I kind of came up with out of nowhere. And so what I started thinking about is adversity can be your super fuel. And there's so many examples in life. The one I use all the time is, Michael Jordan, what happened his sophomore year in high school where he got cut from his high school basketball team. I think he didn't quit after that. But it's just the idea that you need to taste rock bottom first, before you kind of eventually succeed. And you know what? That's life. And, to me, the idea of this principle is, I use this with my kids all the time. My son's playing college baseball. He's had 2 shoulder surgeries in 3 years. Brutal. What are you going to do? You either, you can complain about it or you can pick yourself up and do your rehab and get back at it. I mean, this is going to happen in life, whether it's your personal life, whether it's in business, family, anything. And so It's just going to make you. It's going to make you ultimately strong. I'm going to give you a great baseball analogy. Remember in 2003, the Red Sox-Yankees series. The Red Sox lose the Yankees on a walk-off home run by, of course, Aaron Boone against a great knuckleballer, Tim Wakefield.
Watch that game, man.
What happened the next year, 2004, the Red Sox are down 3-0, right? And Kevin Millar, incidentally, a glue guy, gets up in front of the world media and smile, and he says, "We're going to shock the world." And the Red Sox come back, win 4 straight, beat the Yankees. And if you talk to any member of that
which
Red
has
Sox,
never been done before. Let's just let everybody know that, to go 0-3
right,
and win the remaining 4 games, never been done before. Boston Red Sox do it.
Every member of that Red Sox team, every member said there's no way we win in 0-4 if we hadn't had that incredible loss in 0-3, because we learned. And so, when I talk to groups about this, and when I talk about my book to whether it's athletic teams or Fortune 500 companies, I say the same thing, is that sometimes going through adversity makes you fearless. So Anthony, what you've gone through in terms of experience with Bitcoin, like how much worse can it get? Well, the answer is actually, it was pretty bad for a while. But in the future, you're going to be fine because you went through that. And it's just having that kind of mental toughness. And so the idea of embracing adversity. I
don't know if you have an opinion of it or anything, but what does the agency think about Bitcoin? There's rumors out there that the agency invented Bitcoin. You think that's BS?
I have no idea. I'm not sure. I think, it's, I guess sometimes it's harder to track. I don't know. But who knows? We're probably giving credit for a lot of things we didn't do.
Right. Well, yeah, amen. You're probably getting credit or sometimes discredit. There's a lot of nonsensical conspiracy theories and so forth. Let's talk a little bit about your time in Afghanistan. You were in Iraq. You were in Afghanistan. I obviously only spent a week in each of those countries, but man, I thought they were very different countries. There's just a whole different culture in both those countries. So set the scene for us. What was your time like in Iraq, and what was it like in Afghanistan, and how did
setting the scene is a perfect way to think about this, because ultimately, and I wrote about this and talked about it on Morning Joe a couple of weeks ago, as we kind of did a retrospective on the 20-year anniversary of Iraq. But you have to remember that whether it's Afghanistan, Iraq, or Syria, I was a tool of the U.S. government. It's a sharp tool. It's one that is employed with care. But so I'm not going to give an impression on whether it was right or wrong. For me, it was the idea of answering the bell. And so the U.S. government trained me to do something. I was asked to go. I volunteered to go, in fact, begged to go in both those places, because that's what we do. But ultimately, both were quite different. In Iraq, certainly before the war, as I was living up with the Kurds in northern Iraq, and then when the war kicked off, I went in with the Navy SEALs for what we call the high-value target hunt, when we're tracking down members of Saddam's regime. But my recollection of this was not anything about WMD or anything like that. It was that I had run Iraq operations for a while, and Saddam Hussein was an evil bastard. One of the worst dictators of the century. And the sense that we had is that we were actually helping the Iraqi people. Now, everyone might kind of scoff at that now after not finding WMD, but if you knew the Iraqis and knew what they had gone through under a brutal dictator, this was a chance to do something different. So that was kind of the feeling I had there. In Afghanistan, far different emotions for me, because, and this is not, I'm going to give you just a personal view of this. It's about revenge. I was in New York on 9/11. Going to Afghanistan, I was a base chief in eastern Afghanistan. I ran one of our paramilitary bases, and our job was pure and simply to track down high-value targets, and that's find, fix, and finish missions along with the U.S. military against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. And for me, it was avenging the deaths of 3,000 Americans. It was avenging the death of terrorists who killed my fellow CIA officers. And so, there was never a day I woke up and said, boy, I wish I was back home. I loved every second of my time in Afghanistan, because I thought what we were doing was absolutely righteous. This is far different than nation building, far different than what probably a lot of people's experiences there. But for me, I'm extraordinarily proud of what we did, because the Americans are safer for sure from what my team and my fellow colleagues accomplished there.
I know that we are safer. but tell us why we are safer, because you hear all this cynical nonsense in the press. So, and we've also, I don't want to jinx us, but we've also managed to really, in the last 21, 22 years, curb any monumental terror attacks in the United States. So tell us why we're safer.
Right. So look, every day, there's a great poster that was put up at CIA headquarters. Every day, just think about this. Every day is September 12th. Every day is September 12th. What does that mean? You get up every day saying that what happened on September 11th will never happen again. And I'll tell you, as a member of the intelligence community, we considered, September 11th a failure. Right. I mean, I know we had to be perfect, and we weren't. Mm-hmm. And so when you say every day is September 12th, we're going to do everything possible so that doesn't happen again. And again, lots of retrospectives, obviously, with the withdrawal from Afghanistan. But you know what? We weren't attacked again on our homeland. And I think the men and women of CIA and the intelligence community and the U.S. military deserve a hell of a lot of credit, even if we made mistakes in Afghanistan, even if we stayed too long. Fine, got it. But at the end of the day, we were not attacked again. And that's because of the resolve. Look, I have a friend. This is an incredible story. I can't tell you his name. He spent 10 years on the bin Laden hunt. Think about that. Every day he woke up for 10 years. Most of the time he was deployed in South Asia, in Pakistan or Afghanistan. Not married, no girlfriends, maybe a girlfriend or two or whatever, but no personal life. Every day for 10 years he hunted bin Laden. Thank God we have people like that who have that. I didn't have that resolve. I went back and forth. He was there for 10 damn years. And those are the kind of people that, God bless, we have them, working for us.
It's a listen, it's an amazing story. And, like you said, we've got to be 100% right. General Kelly and I have become very close, and he told me the story, which is now declassified, about the laptop bombs that they were making for these computers. And they were going to bring laptops onto the planes and blow the planes up with these laptop bombs. And of course, the Homeland Security, CIA, everyone had to make a decision to continue to allow laptops to come into the United States or even be flown around domestically in the United States. And of course, we disrupted that terror cell, got all the information, and adjusted our security screening so that we could continue to have our laptops on planes.
I think, Anthony, people are we can't forget, and I think we have, that people were terrified.
Yes,
that there was another attack coming.
I remember it like it was yesterday.
Right.
Not only terrified, but I think it's also important for people to know that the terror is still out there, which is why we're spending all of this money to disrupt terror. And as you know, we have to be perfect. They just got to get it right once.
That's right. And it's only us. We're the ones, we'd always say to each other, there's nobody else. There's no, if CIA doesn't, if we're not successful, there's no backup right behind us. Right. We're on the ramparts. And so, that was a tremendous responsibility, but I think a lot of us have a lot of pride in terms of the counterterrorism work we did.
Where are we today in terms of our safety?
Wow, what a great question. So the world has changed. We were so successful in the counterterrorism field that the threat of an attack on our homeland is diminished because of how we have so significantly degraded international terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda. But the world has changed, and now we have, of course, a rising China, which is our kind of long-term pacing threat, and then we have a country like Russia, which is kind of the most near-term threat, particularly to Europe, to NATO. And so the threats are different. And the United States is sometimes, the national security sectors and aircraft carrier move slowly, but we have shifted towards this, what we call great power competition, which is China, Russia. But, Anthony, you saw this in the White House. How humbling is it for the president to get or a national security team to get the president's daily brief? And you can, as a candidate, you can say all you want, but you get that brief every day. Right now, what President Biden's getting, you got what's going on with Russia, Ukraine, the potential threat of the use of a nuclear weapon by Putin. I don't think it's going to happen, but that's out there. You have a rise in China. You also have an Iranian nuclear program that's accelerating. You have a North Korean missile program and nukes as well. Israeli-Palestinian violence. On and on and on. It's pretty sobering.
You have the Yemeni civil war, the complication between Saudi Arabia now and Iran. I mean,
it goes on and on. It's a dangerous.
The only thing I would say about that brief is that when and I try to tell this to people without getting specific, there's just so many things that we don't know, and so we're giving our best guess to people that have to make these decisions. And of course, if the president is making the decision, that means there were 5,000 other people in the United States government couldn't make the decision. That's how difficult it was, and so it filtered up to the president. So it's not only humbling, but it also has prevented me from becoming overly critical and too much of a Monday morning quarterback on people, because there's just so many things that we don't know. So, I know I'm running out of time with you, and I could talk to you all day. I want to talk about Havana syndrome.
Sure.
You have it, struggling with it. Any better? Right. Headaches are better now, or no?
No, Anthony, thanks for asking. Yeah, I've gotten much better. In fact, I went to a 1-month program at Walter Reed at their traumatic brain injury clinic. I've had some subsequent treatment from some former Navy SEAL doctors and specialists, and so it's at the 5-year mark since this happened to me in Moscow in 2017, and I am definitely better, thank God. But it's a marathon. I still have a headache. 5 years with a headache that's been going on 24/7, but much better. My kind of the cognitive abilities are vastly improved. And to me, I think about, of course, my book now, Clarity in Crisis, but I think there might be another book in me about overcoming chronic pain, because it's been an incredible struggle. Thank God I channel my energies. You know this because we have a mutual friend and who's a personal trainer, and Ray. I channel my energies into working out. So I'm a workout fanatic, but I also could see with this battle with chronic pain how people do things like getting hooked on opioids.
No, of course. I mean, chronic pain is
it's been a brutal journey, and so to me, it's an absolute kind of daily struggle. But I've managed to channel it successfully. Thank you for asking, but it certainly has been a marathon, no doubt about that.
So with every one of my authors, I throw out a couple of words. I want them to react in a sort of a quick fire reaction. It could be a sentence or two or even 3. So let's start with the Middle East.
Complicated, and America will never be able to disengage.
And the reason we can never disengage is?
Oil, our dependence on oil. And also just because it's such a volatile area, and I'll throw on top our historic support for Israel.
Yeah. No, it's interesting because, it goes back to Thomas Hobbes, in the Leviathan, written almost 500 years ago. What Hobbes said is you need one hegemonic power to suppress the internecine conflicts. If you can do that, you can get to world peace. If you don't have a hegemonic power doing that, these tribal conflicts, these disagreements, they bubble up. And of course, you and I are students of Middle Eastern history, so we know that the Sykes-Picot Treaty, the treaty that was put together by the French and the British as they were leaving Palestine and the Middle East, as the Ottoman Empire was crumbling, those guys were a little dastardly. They created border disputes in every single country. So those tribes are still fighting over the varying borders. So the World War I in the Middle East has not ended, Mark. You and I both know that. And so a result of which the United States definitely needs to be there. I'm just wondering, though, about what Henry Kissinger would say, where he said, don't let the Russians in, don't let the Chinese in. We seem to have let both the Russians and Chinese.
We certainly have. I think that, this is more of a complicated discussion, but I think President Obama, the Obama administration, let the Russians into Syria in particular. And now the Chinese influence in the Middle East is quite significant. You actually see Saudi Arabia tilting towards China. Mm-hmm. But that's also a reflection, I think, of it's not a unipolar world anymore. The United States is not the dominant power, but China is right behind us. Mm-hmm. And so we're just going to have to live with that, I think. In the years to come.
Yeah, no question. So let's go right there. China, or as Trump would say, China.
It's our longest term, our pacing threat. I think, though, and perhaps this is a bit controversial when I say this, I'm not as convinced that we will inevitably have a war with China, because China wants one thing, and that's 9% growth. China is not Russia. China's economic interests, trump everything else. And so I think we're going to have to learn how to coexist with another power in the world. But I'm not as convinced we will have armed conflict, I think, as others are, because China ultimately values stability and they want that 9% growth.
Yeah, and I also think they are long-term planners, and they don't need a conflict today that's going to disrupt the long-term plan. But you think they invade Taiwan?
I do not.
Yeah.
I think that the lesson of Ukraine is going to be, front and center in their mind. And as long as we kind of continue on with strong deterrent capability, I do not think they will. Again, that would threaten the world economy, certainly threaten China's economy. It doesn't make sense to me why they would do that.
It was nice to see former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo in the Ukraine going against the MAGA narrative. It's a fight for the democracy, and it's also a fight for the stability of the West. So let's go to that monolithic country, 13 time zones, the largest landmass in the world, Russia.
I would say it's a country ruled by a war criminal. Enormously disappointing, I think, to many. You had the old German view that Russia could be integrated into Europe. I think that has been, shattered totally. And ultimately, while we're going to have to continue supporting Ukraine as they try to push Russian out of their territory, what happens the day after the war ends? How do we deal, assuming Putin's in power, with a bruised and battered Russia? That's going to be kind of a key issue of our time. That's what the National Security Council is focused on. I strongly believe Ukraine is going to win this war. But I don't think anybody understands what happens the day after.
Okay, so you got the Ukrainians winning the war. What does that mean for Vladimir Putin and his regime?
Right, so Putin is going to have to find a way to somehow couch this as a success when he inevitably is going to have to. He will lose. He will have to withdraw. One of the things is that Russia is a pretty monolithic police state, so he seems to have kind of the hold on power. But at the end of the day, I think one of the things that I find fascinating is I'm not sure we understand Russia and the Russian people as much as we think. The notion that the Russian people are somehow going to rise up against him, I'm not sure that's accurate. My friends of mine who know Russia far better than I see a population that is demoralized and has just kind of accepted that they have this war criminal in power. So I'm really, again, I think that it's the notion that somehow Putin is going to be deposed. I think that's that kind of that silver bullet idea is a bit fanciful. But how this ends is going to be quite curious. He's going to have some reason to kind of call it quits. I say this all the time, and I say it in the media, and people always are quite horrified. The only thing that matters every day is the amount of Russians we send home in body bags, us and the Ukrainians together. That is going to be how this war eventually ends.
Now, listen, it's a terrible thing to say because both you and I know how devastating war can be, and we know that it unravels. The rhetoric, the hot rhetoric, turns into real personal tragedy for so many families and individuals. Two last ones. Okay, you ready? USA, the United States.
I still have hope. Here's a great. I go around and I speak to universities all the time, and there's so much negativity in the media, and a lot of it is justified. The events of January 6th, I think, are a historic stain on our country. You have a Republican Party that nobody can really recognize anymore. But then I go and I talk to Generation Z. I go and talk to the youth. And you know what? They still are interested in public service. They are not as depressed or demoralized as sometimes many of us in the media are. And so I think there is hope for the future. It's our job to try to pass the torch correctly. But I still think of America as the shining city on the hill. Anthony, when you travel overseas, go by a U.S. embassy, and in the consular section, even now there are long lines of people who want to immigrate to the United States. We are still seen as the land of political and economic freedom, and nobody should forget that with all of our problems.
Yeah.
So I still have hope.
Yeah, we've hurt ourselves. Listen, I love the country. It's a resilient country, and it will improve. And, like you said about Reagan, our best days are probably ahead of us as we reform ourselves, as we always had. We've had a civil war, 2 world wars. We've had setbacks related to the the Cold War, now we're experiencing a tremendous amount of tribalism.
Right.
Some of that is actually being infected by intelligence forces that are adversarial to the U.S. You and I both know that these
Right.
robotic server farms are designed to influence Americans, make them feel bad about themselves, or make them hate other Americans. And so, we'll figure it out as time goes on. I'm super optimistic about America and love the country and want to be part of the solution. Last one, CIA.
It's the nation's first line of defense. Key part that CIA has to understand is with the explosion in open source data, we have to remain relevant. And that means we have to be able to continue.
Even though he tells lies on facts, he also have attacked the media to the point where, at least for his followers, there almost is no, this is the truth and this is a lie. It's just, well, this person says this and that person says that, and they're biased anyway. A lot of his supporters, not only do they not focus on his lies, but they say he's a truth teller, he's a truth bringer. Even if he gets certain facts wrong, and some of them even say this, he might get certain facts wrong, but he speaks the truth in a sort of capital T way because he says things other people are afraid to say. So they're more focused on that aspect of truth than on any individual fact. So he owns the Republican Party now. Republicans used to be for immigration reform, George W. Bush, Reagan. They used to be strongly pro-free trade. Trump has moved them 360 degrees on both of those issues. It's his party.
Well, welcome to Open Book. I am your host, Anthony Scaramucci. Joining us today is Ian Reifowitz. He is a distinguished professor at the State University of New York. And his book, Riling Up the Base. Does the base need to be riled? That's the question. But Riling Up the Base, examining Trump's use of stereotypes through an interdisciplinary lens. Quite the academic title. It's an academic book, but I enjoyed the book because it was a fairly brief book, by the way. But it was loaded with great anecdotes and loaded with lots of sociology. I felt like this was a little bit of a sociology book. Jane Goodall, who studies alpha primates, could have wrote the foreword for you, late and great Jane Goodall. But welcome to the program and congratulations. Before we dive into the book, what led you and your co-author, I think it's Anastasia Curillo, hopefully I'm getting that right, into writing this book, Riling Up the Base, Ian?
Well, first, thanks, Anthony, so much for having me on. It's a pleasure. And I think, we're all sad about the loss of Jane Goodall, a real giant in the world of science. So, the book really grew out of an idea that my wonderful co-author, Anastasia, had to study stereotypes. And, she has a lot of knowledge in the areas of sociology, communication, psychology. And we were talking, and I said, well, and we basically settled on the idea of looking at Trump's use of stereotypes because he was, had the most powerful megaphone in the world, the most powerful position in the world. And he is using stereotypes and has been using stereotypes for years in a way that no other political figure who has reached anywhere close to his level has reached. So I think it started out in a sort of abstract and then moved into the specific area of Trump simply because of what he was doing.
Well, is it something he did, and you address this, so I want you to address this for our viewers and listeners. Is it something he did intuitively? Is it something him and his campaign got together on and said, here's how we're going to manifest this? How did this come about?
I think it's largely intuition. I don't see Donald Trump, sitting there, scratching his chin like a great thinker and saying, what's the best way for me to express my rhetoric politically? I think he's somebody who has, and you would know this more personally than I would certainly, but he's somebody who has, I think, an individual style that he has been using now for 4 decades, and that has worked for him. And I think it's almost naturalistic. The one thing that's really interesting, though, because you mentioned talking with his strategists, when he was planning to run for president in 2015 and was going to make that speech coming down the escalator at Trump Tower to announce his candidacy, he had some prepared remarks. Before he wrote, or before he and his people put those remarks together, he asked, I believe it was Mr. Nunberg, to look into what was really animating talk radio listeners, because I think he had a sense that was where his audience was. And they came back to him and they said immigration, 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 borders, sovereignty, and the sense that we had lost our borders and we're losing our sovereignty. So they wrote these remarks for him, and there was a line or two about immigration, but the remarks that really grabbed people, which were stereotype remarks, which we highlight, was the section where he talked about Mexican immigrants, people coming across the Rio Grande as being rapists and murderers and drug dealers. That was actually ad-libbed, which is interesting. This is from I believe it was a Gabriel Sherman article, who did the research. So he had this idea from his researchers to talk about immigration, but he just sort of ran with it. And I think he responds to the response he feels from an audience. And after that speech, and then in particular after the first Republican debate, when again he hammered Jeb Bush on immigration, used some some stereotypes of immigrants, he shot right to the top of the polls for the Republican nomination, went from single digits to 25%, and he really never looked back. So his rhetoric around immigrants and specifically those stereotypes, they may have been an ad lib, but they did come from research, and he stuck with them because they worked.
Okay, and I agree with all that, but when I read the book, I want to test something on you. So when I read the book, something popped out at me that I didn't see prior to reading the book, and that is the populism was there for the plucking, and the fear of immigration, American nativism, xenophobia was there. And I submit to you, and I want to get your reaction to this, had Donald Trump run against Barack Obama, even in '08, possibly 2012, he might have beaten him. He might have had a more galvanized, more passionate voting base than a standard Republican like a Mitt Romney or a John McCain. What say you?
I mean, it's a good question. I'm not a great backwards prognosticator. Um, he did talk about running in 2012, and then ultimately decided not to. I think Obama was a better communicator than Hillary Clinton was. I don't think that's a stretch to make that case. I think he's a better communicator than Kamala Harris and Joe Biden. So I don't think in the end that he would have been able to defeat Barack Obama, uh, because at that point, certainly in '08, the country wanted to move away from Republicans. Now, Trump was a different kind of Republican. He could have run against the Bush establishment, although in some ways McCain had, sort of positioned himself as a different kind of Republican. It's an interesting question. I think in '08, the Republican brand was so badly tarnished by Bush's handling of the economy that I think any Republican would have had a very difficult time. Could Trump have gotten in 2012? Maybe, but I do think Obama was getting credit for the recovery that he had initiated. So I think I can't give you a hard yes and a hard no,
Yeah,
but go
well,
ahead.
I'll give you an example. Okay, Trump endorsed Romney, and we were having a hard time in Michigan, believe it or not. And Trump made a series of robocalls into rural Michigan for Romney. Even though Romney grew up there, his father was he was a CEO of AMC, American Motors Corporation. Romney was having a hard time with the populism that was rising in Michigan, and Trump boosted his support there. He ended up winning the Michigan primary. I just feel like the point that you're making, which I'd like for you to say in your own words, but the central argument I got from the book is that stereotypes more than policy secured the election, and just these stereotypes that are giving him this ongoing support. So tell me if I'm right about that, because that's more or less what I got from the book.
Yeah, it is. And the key is that we're talking about how he riled up the base. It helped him more in the Republican primary than anywhere else. And I think that was what that's the argument that we're trying to make from a political standpoint. It's how he separated himself from 16 other, most of whom were reasonably qualified Republicans in 2016. And it's the same thing that would explain why he would have helped Mitt Romney in the Republican primary in 2012. I don't think it helped him as much in the general election, but you know, he was the only one in the Republican primary in 2016 talking the way he did. He was really in many ways the only populist. He was the only one running against trade, and our book is not about economic policy, but he's the only one running against the sort of Republican orthodoxy on free trade, which had gone over it, and many centrist Democrats had adopted, going back to Bill Clinton and NAFTA. So I think it helped him in the Republican primary set himself apart. In the general election, at the end of the day, not to get all political and data driven, I think he probably would have lost had it not been for Comey. Right, in the end, Hillary won by 2.5%, and another 1% would have added enough in those 3 states. But he definitely needed that base to be riled up, and that base was dominant within the Republican Party. Maybe it's 1/3 of the whole country, but it was a majority of Republicans.
Okay, so give me the stereotype. Go ahead, let me hear the stereotype.
Right, so we mentioned one of them, which is around Mexican immigrants. He also used stereotypes around urban crime. Right, he talked about how people living in the suburbs would see their suburbs ruined by Obama-Biden policies that would bring crime and gangs and people you wouldn't like into your neighborhoods, drawing on fears about Black youths, so to speak, coming into the cities. He used stereotypes around gender, specifically with both Hillary and Kamala. He talked about them being weak, right? So especially in 2024, he used a lot of sort of masculine, coded as strong stereotypes to refer to himself. He talked about how tough bikers liked him. He talked about how, well, maybe they were white dudes for Harris, but their wives and their wives' lovers were for him because he was virile and strong. And then, the Harris supporters are weak. So there's that whole strong, weak thing around gender. There's a whole crime thing around Black and Latino immigrants. He talking about Muslims. He said Islam hates us. And here's another interesting distinction, right? George W. Bush, another Republican, so forget about Democrats not using stereotypes. After 9/11, George Bush said, Islam is peace. We are not at war with Islam. Donald Trump says, Islam hates us, right? So even there, you can see a strong contrast. That's not a left-right contrast. So those are a few examples from the book that we draw on.
Hiring isn't just about finding someone willing to take the job. I need the right person with the right background who can move our business forward. If I wanted candidates who match what I'm looking for, join the 1.6 million companies that sponsor their jobs with Indeed. If I needed to hire a new editor, I'd go to Indeed and be super specific. Not just can edit audio. I'd say I need someone who's edited conversational podcasts for the last 3 years, gets our style, and knows our software. Someone who's done this before. And here's the thing, with Indeed sponsored jobs, I'd get people who fit that description. I'm not digging through resumes from people who've edited one YouTube video. I'm getting actual podcast editors who know what they're doing. People who've worked on shows like ours and can prove it. That's what makes the difference. You get people who actually are doing what you're looking for. Plus, with Indeed sponsored jobs, you only pay for results. No monthly subscriptions, no long-term contracts, just the boost whenever you need to find quality talent fast. People are finding quality hires on Indeed right now. In the minute I've been talking to you, companies like yours made 27 hires on Indeed, according to Indeed data worldwide. Spend more time interviewing candidates who check all the boxes. Less stress, less time, more results now with Indeed sponsored jobs. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to help get your job the premium status it deserves at Indeed.com/openbook. Just go to Indeed.com/openbook right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/openbook. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring? Do it the right way with Indeed. I want to hear the stereotype of the Trump voter in your mind that would appeal to the stereotypes that Trump was exerting and verbalizing during these 3 campaigns.
So one of the things we look at in the book is the development of resentment. Right? We talk about political correctness, and then we talk about, closer to the 2016 election, microaggressions. People started to be called out, for lack of a better word, even for saying things that they didn't intend to mean to be offensive. And then, so you have people who are resentful about this whole trend in the culture. And then Trump comes along and says, not only he doesn't have to say this, but his words say, not only do you have to not worry, you shouldn't even worry about these unintentional microaggressions. Hell, you can use intentional stereotypes, and there's not going to be any punishment for you. In fact, I'm going to show you that it can be a reward. So I think the kind of person who was drawn to this is a person who was resentful of political correctness, resentful of what they saw as a stifling, perhaps liberal culture. And I can't get into, I don't know how you would stereotype those voters sort of demographically. That's not something I'm familiar with, but I would say that there is an ideological sort of component of people who are fed up with being told what not to say. It was sort of the same thing that you had sort of shock jocks doing. I mean, to some degree, Rush Limbaugh is a model for Trump. He used to love to tweak people on the left, by showing what you could get away with. And rebelliousness is fun, right? Breaking the rules is fun. So the people who found that appealing, I think, are the people in Trump's base who found his rhetoric appealing.
The Washington Post reported in the first term Trump won about 34,000 documented lies. He's on pace to tell 40,000 lies this time, so he's just amped up the lies. The journalists have a real hard time with this, Ian, because when they interview him and one lie after the other is coming out of his mouth, they have to make a decision. Do we just spend the interview fact-checking him, calling him out on his lies, letting him talk, getting his words out there? They seem to have sided with the latter. They're just going to let him get his words out there. Why is that so effective? I mean, other politicians that are caught in those bold-faced lies, people look at, okay, oh my God, I mean, we know politicians lie, but this stuff is ridiculous. So how does he get away with it?
I think he is following something that Steve Bannon said, which is basically you flood the zone, right? And if you flood the zone, it's impossible to focus on any one thing. But there's another piece to this, which is that even though he tells lies on facts, he also, and this is something that his allies are very good at, have attacked the media to the point where, at least for his followers, there almost is no, well, this is the truth and this is a lie. It's just, well, this person says this and that person says that, and they're biased anyway. One of the things that we found in doing the research is that a lot of his supporters, not only do they not focus on his lies, but they say he's a truth teller, he's a truth bringer, right? Even if he gets certain facts wrong, and some of them even say this, he might get certain facts wrong, but he speaks the truth in a sort of capital T way, because he says things other people are afraid to say. So they're more focused on that aspect of truth than on any individual fact. So I don't know, maybe the journalists feel like that it's almost useless to try, that they'll be branded as anti-Trump if they try to correct him, and maybe they're intimidated. I mean, that's another possibility, certainly.
Yeah, because he's a bully. And so when you bully people, a lot of people will fall in line so they won't face the wrath of the bully. And of course, the bully's job is to pick out the people who are coming at the bully and crush the weak ones to scare the ones into continued compliance. So, this stuff that has obviously worked for him. He's a formidable political figure, but you talk about his blunt and repetitive style. You talk about the dog whistles, the foghorns. How much of his success is about this formula? In other words, he's found a formula. I can beat the following drumbeat of populism and prejudices and racial biases, and that's going to be enough for me to get to the presidency. Or up against that, is it just a failure of the Democratic Party to field reasonable candidates? Because when you poll on Trump, he's not well liked.
Right. I mean, then it doesn't have to be one or the other, right? It's all of these things. When you
Right.
talk about somebody who won an election in 2016 by a sliver, I mean, a true sliver, it's all of the above. I do think even though he's not a traditionally polished presidential communicator, I do think, and I absolutely agree with you, he's an effective communicator. Repetition is a way of getting your point across, right? And not only repetition, but emphasis. He uses hyperbole a lot. He says, nope, his constant refrain is nobody's ever seen anything like this before, or nobody's ever been as good as this, or as good as me. It's and that breaks through. It breaks through for his audience. And I mean, one of the things we talk about in the book, and I don't want to get deep into the academic theories, is the idea that there are certain ways that communication is effective. And repetition is one of those ways, and he's very good at it. Now, having said that, could a more effective opponent have done better? Absolutely. I mean, certainly Hillary Clinton made some serious communication mistakes. Most people are familiar with the deplorables remark. That's going to go down in history as one of the worst gaffes a presidential candidate has ever made, right? Because even there, she's stereotyping his opponents in that sense. And that was very alienating. And I've read some research that says that some focus groups that were done sort of over time, tracking focus groups, that statement cost her more votes than anything else in this one, sort of tracking group, a group that was tracked. Kamala Harris, the trans ad was devastating because he had her on tape, in her words, taking a position that I think most Americans found pretty extreme, that the government was going to pay for, I believe, undocumented immigrant prisoners' trans surgeries. Most Americans think that is not something that the government should be doing, but she's on tape doing it. Why? Because Democratic groups put her on the spot and made her, not made her, but got her to say that. Well, this ad, which does draw on stereotypes, right? The ad has Kamala talking, and then it has, I believe, some images of like a bald man with a mustache and lipstick wearing a dress, like stereotypical, images of what I think many people, and I think what Trump would say, are people who are outside the mainstream. Well, those are the people that Kamala is for. She's for they, them. I'm for you, I believe he said. Very effective. So it's effective communication, but it's also a bad job by Democrats in communicating their own ideas and finding candidates who can do it well.
I don't even know how they fall into his traps all the time. Like, they looked at that ad and said, well, there's only like 10 or 12 people who are identified as trans that have actually played in high school sports. How could this be a big deal? And so they miss these cultural totems. I have told people on my podcast, Donald Trump is the Napoleon of the culture war. He can see the whole battlefield. He can anticipate your moves. Why do you think the Democrats are always caught flat-footed when we've now had 10 years of the same predictive algorithm emanating from Donald Trump?
All right, so that's a great question, and it's a little bit of sort of prognostication, which I'm happy to engage in. I have actually written about this somewhat separate from this book, where I talked about how Democrats have lost the sense of Obama's more balanced vision of the way to talk about America. I think they've become, since certainly 2020, at least with the George Floyd movement, you had a sense in the Democratic Party that the most marginalized groups should have the loudest platform, and that it's wrong somehow to criticize what the most marginalized groups want, or what they want you to say, or how they want you to talk. And it's a bit of an echo chamber, right? Because if the only people in the room are people who are all on that same page, then nobody's going to stand up and say, hey, maybe Kamala, you shouldn't, maybe Senator Harris, you shouldn't support that position. Because if somebody says that, then other people in the room are going to say, how dare you? Those marginalized groups need our support. And certainly in a moral sense, they do need support, but that's not how you win a presidency. And it's certainly not how you run against somebody like Donald Trump, who is, as you said, really good at this. And I think he clearly feels it in his gut, right? He's, I don't know if lucky is the right word, but the feelings he has about culture issues are feelings that motivate a lot of people and motivate them strongly.
I'm now down to the last part of this podcast where we pick 5 words from your book. My producer and I go through the book. We come up with 5 words. I want the author to react to the 5 words. Okay, so if I say the word stereotypes, you say what? You give me a sentence or two.
They're not true, right? Or they're not accurate, I should say, right? But they're very powerful. Stereotypes are powerful. So there's 3 words for your 1 word.
Okay. What if I say the word base?
Base are people who are with Trump, ride or die. They're with Trump no matter what happens, and they feel like he speaks for them. It's not about tariffs. It's not about any other policy. He is their guy.
No problem. He can bunker bust the Iranians. He can withhold the Epstein files. Doesn't matter. He's our guy, and we're riding or dying. Very well said. I say the word Democrat.
Cautious. They're cautious, and they're also confused, and they're divided. I think they're united around opposing Trump, but they're divided about how best to do it.
Yeah, they're in a civil war with themselves, and they are. If you said that to me, Democrats, I said the best thing that's ever happened to Donald Trump, because that's exactly how he keeps winning. Okay, I say the word Republican. You say what?
Trump. He owns the Republican Party now. Think
Yeah.
about this, right?
Well said.
Republicans, I was just going to say quickly, Republicans used to be for immigration reform, George W. Bush, Reagan. They used to be strongly pro-free trade. Trump has moved them, 360 degrees on both of those issues. It's his party.
Okay, very well said. I'll give you the last word, but I'm going to give you my last word, Trump.
The most important political and cultural figure in this century.
Yes, no question about that. Well, we have no disagreement there. Like him or dislike him, no disagreement there. Riling Up the Base, Anastasia Kirillo and Ian Reifowitz. I'll tell you what, great book. I really enjoyed reading it. Available on Amazon. That's where I found it. And I think people read this book, they'll have great insight into what happened. And it's incredibly well researched. Thank you so much for joining us today on Open Book.
Thank you, Anthony. It was really a pleasure.